Today, we are diving deep into a story that's about so much more than just laws. It's about identity, dignity, and the very long, very human struggle for equality. We're going to unpack the history, the social forces, and the ongoing fight for LGBTQ+ rights. So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll define what this struggle really looks like. Then, we'll dig into the deep roots of this inequality. After that, we'll track the incredible fight for basic rights, really look at the human cost of all this bias, and finally, we'll talk about the road ahead, because this journey is far from over. To really get a handle on the present, you have to look at the past. And we're starting in a pretty dark place in American history, the Lavender Scare. This was happening right alongside the anti-communist Red Scare in the 1950s, but this time, the target was different. I mean, just listen to that. That's a quote from J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI at the time. This wasn't just some fringe opinion, this was the mindset at the highest levels of power. It paints a chilling picture of a systematic campaign that framed gay people not just as immoral, but as a genuine threat to the nation itself. So, what do you call something like this? Well, sociologists have a term for it, a moral panic. It's when a particular group gets singled out, and this wave of, frankly, irrational fear is whipped up to paint them as a danger to society. It's a playbook we saw during the Lavender Scare, and honestly, you can still see echoes of it in some of the debates happening today. Okay, before we go any further, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with some key terms. Sexual orientation is all about who you're attracted to. LGBTQ+ is the acronym we use for the community. Cisgender is a term for someone whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth. And then there's this really crucial idea, heteronormativity. It's the built-in cultural assumption that being straight is the default, the norm. And that mindset is so important because it can make everything else seem abnormal, when the reality is that all of this exists on a wide human spectrum. All right, so with that history in our minds, let's go a layer deeper. Let's really get into the cultural and social soil where the roots of this inequality took hold. And that leads us to the big question, right? Why? Why has this kind of bias been so stubborn, so persistent through so much of history? Well, the answer is pretty complex, and it's woven into some of our oldest institutions. You can really trace it back to three major sources. For one, certain religious interpretations have historically condemned any sex that wasn't for procreation. Then, you had the medical world, which treated it like a sickness. It's wild to think about, but homosexuality was officially classified as a mental disorder right up until 1973. And finally, you have these super rigid gender roles where society punished anyone who stepped outside the traditional boxes of what it meant to be a man or a woman. So how do academics try to make sense of this? Well, there are two big ways of looking at it. One is the structural functionalist view, which basically sees society as a machine. From that perspective, anything that didn't help the traditional family procreate was seen as deviant or a broken part. But then you have the conflict perspective, which sees it much more as a straightforward power struggle. One group fighting for the power, the resources, and the respect that the dominant group has always had. Okay, so we've talked about the theories behind the prejudice. Now let's get into the action, the real-world, concrete battles that were fought in courtrooms and in the streets to win basic human rights. And there was no fight more visible than the one for marriage equality. You can see the whole roller coaster right here. It started with a huge roadblock in 1996 with the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA. But then the tide started to turn. In 2013, a Supreme Court case called Windsor knocked down the core of that law. Then came the big one in 2015, Obergefell, the landmark decision that made same-sex marriage illegal everywhere in the U.S. And just recently, in 2022, Congress passed the Respect for Marriage Act to try and lock those protections into federal law. Another massive legal win came in 2020 with Bostock v. Clayton County. This was a total game changer. The Supreme Court said that the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964 does, in fact, protect people from being fired just for being gay or transgender. Now, it's worth noting that protection isn't absolute. It mostly applies to businesses with 15 or more employees, but it was still a huge step forward. So, winning in court is one thing, but what's the day-to-day reality? What's the real human cost when a society is biased against you? That's where this story gets deeply personal. Take a look at this number, 17.2%. According to the FBI, that's the share of all reported hate crimes in 2022 that were motivated by someone's sexual orientation. This isn't just a statistic, Behind that number are thousands of people who were targeted and attacked for who they love. So this begs a question. Does winning legal rights actually reduce hate? Well, sociologists are actually split on this. There's the legitimacy hypothesis, which says, yes, of course, when the law approves of something, society follows, and hate crime should go down. But then there's the polarization hypothesis, which argues that these big wins can actually make the opposition dig in their heels even more, creating backlash and maybe even more conflict. It's a really tough dynamic. And the human cost is perhaps most devastating when you look at young people. This chart is it's brutal. But it's so important to see. According to the CDC, LGBTQ high school students are far more likely to think about, plan, and attempt suicide than their straight peers. This isn't a mystery. It's a direct result of living with stigma, rejection, and discrimination. So all of this brings us to right now, to our final section. Because for all the progress, for all the hard-won victories, the path to true lived equality is still very much unfinished. Let's look at where things stand today. A huge piece of the puzzle right now is the proposed Equality Act. The goal is pretty simple: to update the Civil Rights Act to explicitly protect people based on sexual orientation and gender identity everywhere. This would create a clear federal standard that says you can't be discriminated against in housing, in healthcare, at your job, pretty much in any key area of life. It would close a lot of the gaps that still exist in state laws. And here's what's so fascinating. Look at the public support for this. Nearly 80% of Americans, and that's across the political spectrum, believe that LGBTQ+ people should be protected from discrimination. The public consensus is actually overwhelming. But even the biggest victories are more fragile than you might think. Get this. Even though the Supreme Court made same-sex marriage the law of the land in 2015, there are still 32 states that have old, useless-for-now bans on their books. They're like dormant laws, just sitting there. And if the Supreme Court ever decided to reverse its ruling, those bans could snap right back into effect overnight. And that really leaves us with the question for our time. We've seen this incredible, decades-long march of progress. We've seen monumental legal victories. But now, those very same rights are facing new and really organized challenges. So you have to ask, is that long path to equality still moving forward, or are we in danger of sliding back?